Welcome to the Divorce Podcast, where we explore all aspects of ending relationships, separation, and parenting apart. If your marriage or partnership has ended, or you have friends and family who are separating, this podcast is for you. I'm Kate Daly, a relationship counsellor, divorce specialist, and co-founder of Amicable, the online legal service for separating couples. In each episode, we look at relationships and separation from different angles, including the emotional, legal, and social. I'm joined by experts and special guests who share their own unique stories, experience, and tips with the goal of helping people end relationships in a kinder and better way. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Angharad Rudkin and Anthony Syder. Angharad is a clinical psychologist with over 20 years' experience working with children and their families and lecturing on child psychology at the University of Southampton. In collaboration with Only Mums and Only Dads, Angharad designed and runs the popular What About Henry course for family law professionals. Angharad has co-authored parenting books and children's books and was the consultant editor for the divorce guide 101 Questions about Separation and Divorce with Children. Angharad is also the author of The Split Survival Kit, which she wrote with children's author Ruth Fitzgerald. She regularly appears on TV and radio as an expert on child and family issues and has recently been shortlisted for the Resolution Children's Champion Award. Anthony is a divorce specialist at Amicable and has worked in the area of divorce, mediation and family dispute resolution for the past 8 years. His areas of interest include the voice of the child and diverse and inclusive families. In this episode, we look at what neurodiversity is and we explore how it impacts both neurodivergent adults and children during family separation. Angharad and Anthony share their tips on navigating specific issues around the negotiation process, the legal process, and of course, cooperative parenting. If you loved this episode, then please subscribe and rate us on your preferred listening platform. Welcome, Angharad, and welcome, Anthony. It's lovely to see you both. Thanks very much for joining me. The focus of today's session is neurodiversity, and in the context of separation and divorce, and neurodiversity in the sense of adults with neurodiversity and also children as well. But let's start with some basic definitions so we can ease ourselves into this episode. Angharad, what do we mean by neurodiversity?
Hello, Kate. Thank you for having me back on. Neurodiversity is a term that is becoming more commonly used now to describe people who have brains that are wired differently to what we would call the majority brain, so neurotypicals. And the way the brain works and the way the brain is wired creates sort of differences in terms of sociability and learning and attention. And what we would most commonly think of as neurodiversity is autism spectrum disorders, so ASD, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. But the way that the term is now used, it also includes differences in terms of dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, Tourette syndrome. So it's sort of broadening out to really encompass a lot of the quite common differences that we'll see in how people think and act. And then when it comes to terminology, we also need to be aware that it's a matter of semantics, really, that we can't call an individual neurodiverse because an individual can't be diverse. It's a group that can be diverse. So we would use the term neurodivergent to describe an individual and neurodiversity to describe a group.
A group. Okay. I was going to ask that, the difference between neurodiverse and neurodivergent. Okay, so it's how we refer to either an individual or a group of people. Well, that's interesting. Thank you. And we're going to talk a little bit to start with about adults who are divorcing and separating and maybe neurodivergent. And Anthony, I'm interested to understand from your perspective, when you're helping a couple and one of them is neurodivergent, what are some of the challenges that you face or they face in addition to a person with a neurotypical brain?
Sure. I think it's quite wide-ranging. I think everyone's unique. And I think for me, the initial challenge is creating a space that is safe enough for those people to share with me what their challenges are so that I can understand how I can best help and support them. So sometimes that is around sort of difficulties with forms and numbers on a spreadsheet, for example. Other times it is around the way that they think, and so more the discussion part of the service and the challenges that they might have around that. But I think initially it's just about understanding and creating the space where we can have that conversation about what those challenges are.
And Angharad, what do you think are the most common difficulties that are faced by people who are neurodivergent? What typically happens when there's an emotional crisis in their lives?
Well, what we do know about neurodiversity is that the variation within the population with neurodiversity is as enormous as the diversity within the neurotypicals. So it's very hard to think of a typical person with ASD or a typical person with ADHD. But in general, what we do know is that the symptoms of both ADHD and ASD increase at times of high stress. So when there's, especially for somebody with ASD, for example, when there's a kind of highly social situation or a highly stressful situation or a lot of unpredictability, then the differences become more obvious and more pronounced, just as they do for everybody in terms of when we get stressed, things get magnified for us. And so when you think about going through a divorce and the kinds of stresses that that creates for people, it's no wonder that these symptoms can become magnified. So you might get somebody who becomes incredibly sort of rigid in their thinking and rule-based in their thinking. So we said we were going to do this at this time, therefore we must. And the sort of flexibility that the situation might call for at that point is just very, very hard to create. There's differences sometimes in communication. So sometimes there's less confidence in terms of verbal communication and getting the right words out at the right time. And instead, sort of visual stuff or just being able to write things down is a little bit easier in terms of I can communicate my needs in that way. But all in all, it's a highly stressful situation, and none of us are at our best in many ways. None of us are at our most sort of reasonable and calm and rational and understanding. And so it's just that may be heightened a little bit as well. But just something also to say about it's typically thought of that people with ASD kind of struggle with empathy. And that is not the case. That's not what the research shows. People with ASD can be incredibly empathic. What they might struggle with at times is being able to put themselves in somebody else's shoes to understand why they're acting in a certain way. So things around intentions and understanding people's intentions and actions, that can be a little bit kind of difficult for them to do. It's not that they're sat there being quite kind of cold and not understanding how someone might be feeling. It's more that they can't understand the intentions around it sometimes.
That's really interesting, isn't it, Anthony? Because I know that sometimes one of the kind of trickiest things to navigate, I think, when we're working with people sometimes is this idea of people will ascribe malintent to action sometimes because they're in this sort of heightened, conflicted situation. Whereas a lot of times what people do isn't badly intended. It might land badly, but the intent wasn't, negative or bad. It's just someone's only thinking of it from their perspective or whatever. So if you've got someone who's going to really struggle with that, of being able to understand the intent, that feels like it's quite a big area to kind of explore. And how do you do that, Anthony, in a sort of a safe and contained way in sessions?
Yeah, so I think that the communication is really important. It's about slowing it down and having those conversations. So I often speak to people in their initial session or very early on in the process around, should we have a discussion about how things are going to work whilst we're moving through this process? Almost trying to preempt some of the discussions that are coming, because I think it's easier to have those discussions before things occur rather than in the moment. So just trying to get an understanding of that and start a conversation around that as well. I also make people aware of how I will start each session and some of the questions that I will ask at the beginning of each session, and that I'll give space for them to raise things as well, or that they can raise things that they want to discuss prior to the session too, to give the other person a bit of a heads up. Because I think a lot of the time, if it feels as though it's come out of the blue, even if it's just naturally part of the conversation, it just has naturally come up, if there is a way that we can preempt that, I think that that's always quite useful.
And I guess one of the other things I think that in the amicable process we do is we have this time where we can have one-to-one time with people as well as doing the group time, the couple time. And I guess that gives you the opportunity to ask and to pick up on Angharad's point that there's as much diversity within as there is, between. I guess that gives you the opportunity as well, doesn't it, to really understand that particular person and how whatever their label is or whatever their neurodiversity is, it gives you that opportunity to really dig into that and understand how they experience it, what it's like for them, and what we can do to support them going through something like this.
I was just going to say that that's really useful as well, because these people have been in a relationship with each other. They know each other really well. So we're playing catch up in that regard. So it's important for us to get to know them, because the way that sometimes plays out is that important conversations that we need to have, one person might not be raising them because they know that it will be a difficult subject for the other person, or it might cause upset. And then that conversation is not being had at all. And we aren't aware of all of the behind the scenes thinking going into that. So it's important for us to get to know them individually so that we can help them have the difficult discussions that are necessary to have rather than to avoid them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really key, because sometimes when people are trying to be amicable or trying to stay on good terms, that suppresses important conversations. And it's really important that people aren't amicable to the point of just sweeping things under the carpet or not really fully exploring what the needs are and what needs to happen. That's a really good point. Angharad, you mentioned some typical behaviours and problems that people with ADSD may have. What about ADHD? Are there differences that people with ADHD might experience if they're going through divorce and separation? What we should be looking out for?
Yes, absolutely. So ADHD is a condition which is characterized by high impulsivity. So you kind of act without thinking. Inattentiveness, so you forget things quickly. It's hard to organize. It's hard to plan. You say you're going to do something and then you forget. And then the hyperactivity bit is that, what we would typically think of with ADHD, really, someone who fidgets a lot, is constantly moving, constantly sort of on edge physically. But we also know there's ADD, so you can have the DD bit without the H bit, really. And that's
without the H, yeah.
That's it. So that's a lot quieter. And that's, it's harder to sort of spot that in people and understand that actually they are acting in this way because they're seeing and thinking about things differently to neurotypical. So it might be very hard to tie someone down to appointments, or they might forget to sign forms, or forget to pick up a child at a certain point, or keep asking you, where is it that I'm supposed to be again on Wednesday? So these kinds of things, which in a kind of a intact family, as in a non-divorcing family, can be stressful enough, because the parent who is not somebody with ADHD, for example, feels they have to carry the burden of the planning, the organisation, the structuring, the remembering. But then trying to do that as cooperative parents once you've divorced is incredibly difficult, because, of course, you've got an awful lot more emotions going around as well. And just like with ASD, if it's a highly stressful, highly emotional situation, then the sort of ADHD characteristics are going to come out even more. Somebody's going to be even more sort of impulsive, even more forgetful, even more kind of just seem to be on a different planet. This is how some parents describe it to me. It's like they're on a different planet. Why don't they see what's happening? So it can really impact on the sort of logistics of divorce, but also, in thinking about forms and appointments and things, but also on the sort of cooperative parenting post-divorce as well. It can be quite tricky to keep that going.
Yes, I know. I guess, my son has ADHD, and I know as a parent how hard that is to stay not frustrated. And I love him, and there's no issue between us. But if you add in how much effort it takes when you're also in a state where perhaps it's not even your decision to have left or whatever, and you are effectively grieving on top of that, it must be incredibly difficult to work through.
Yes, I think it really is. And that sense of care as well. So it can look like someone doesn't care. So they're acting like that because they don't care. Whereas in fact, it's because they just don't have the kind of brain that really holds on to that sort of information. And so they forget to do this thing that they've promised they will do, or they forget to turn up and pick that certain thing up, or pick a child up. And we interpret it as they don't care, we're not important to them. But that is absolutely not the case in the majority of times.
So how do you deal with that when you're trying to cooperatively parent? It sounds like the first step, and we're talking as if everybody is diagnosed and knows, that they've got, or they're on a spectrum, or they've got these conditions, but it might not necessarily be the case, might it? You may be seeing this behavior without a diagnosis, which would be incredibly difficult. But assuming people kind of have some understanding of there is this issue within the relationship, as the other parent, the non-divergent parent, what sort of things can you do to cope with this and to try and maintain a cooperative parenting relationship?
I think the biggest thing to work on is your own tolerance and understanding, because at the end of the day, you cannot change your ex in any way, shape, or form, and especially you can't change their brain. So it's understanding that actually, what are the sort of tricky times? Is it about timings? Is it about finances? And working together with your co-parent to really think through, okay, this is something that, might be difficult for you to do, or you might struggle to do, just like I might struggle to do certain other things. What can we do to make it easier? So there's some brilliant apps out there now that help you arrange your finances and your calendars as cooperative parents, and send reminders and ping messages to let you know, remember to do this. So there's those kinds of things that you can use to help with the organization element of it. But I think the most important thing for you, in order for yourself to feel okay and well and balanced, is to learn ways of managing your expectations of your partner and that your ex-partner. And also that this is rarely about, like I said, rarely about care. It's not that they can't be bothered, that they're not interested. It's actually a different way of viewing the world. So it's coming to terms with that, really. And this is them. This is who they are.
I guess that must feature in the way you work with people then, Anthony, this idea of having to have a conversation with both people in terms of tolerance and understanding and building their resilience. What does that normally look like when we're working with couples in the amicable process?
Yeah, so I think it's a lot about a discussion of how we will be sort of speaking to each other, around how the sessions will be set up, planning, if we're going to have an agenda in each of those sessions as well. Sometimes people want those to be a little bit more structured, but there's a lot within the process and within the service that we can be flexible with, be creative with, to make it work for people. But it's not something that we can do unless we're made aware of what those needs are. And so I think it's important to have that initial conversation with, whoever it is that you're speaking with, whether that's a co-parenting specialist or a divorce specialist, so that the service works in the best possible way for you. Because essentially that's what we're all trying to achieve, is an outcome that is the best outcome on balance for everyone. And being able to adapt the process to make that work only benefits everyone involved in that process. It doesn't just benefit that one individual.
Well, I guess one of the other things I was thinking as you were saying that, Anthony, was that we're often compared to a mediation service. Sometimes people call us a mediation service, but we're not. We're slightly different. We're a negotiation service. And one of the big differences, I think, between, say, this and mediation, the way that we work at amicable with the sort of coaching process, is we do allow for having one-to-one individual time. And I think when there's neurodiversity in the picture, then I think that actually makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? To be able to have the one-to-one time, to do some of the coaching around tolerance that Angharad was talking about, and then to be able to really get underneath the skin of how something might manifest to an individual and to make provision for that so that you can have a much better negotiation and a much more supported negotiation than perhaps if you were just doing we'll have to have all of the meetings together, and that might not get to the root of some of the issues. Because I guess still, Angharad, there's maybe still some shame and doubt in people's minds when they've either been, and a lot more people, I guess, now are diagnosed in adulthood as well. So they might be coming to terms with a diagnosis during this stressful time rather than, having been diagnosed as children.
Absolutely. Yes. We are becoming more and more aware of it. And what we don't know is, are rates actually increasing, or is it just that we're becoming more aware of it? And we just don't know. But there may be adults who've recently been diagnosed, or adults who've had, 20 years of living together, and it's been incredibly difficult, and they've got the diagnosis finally, and they've chosen to separate because they don't think they can live together anymore. The thing is with a diagnosis is that it kind of gives you a name and it gives you an understanding, but it doesn't, beyond that, there's nothing you can do about ASD and ADHD. This is the way your brain is. There's a bit of medication potentially for ADHD that might work for some, but it's more a matter of adjusting and adapting to that understanding and that awareness. So it can be a very difficult time, and certainly the stigma and the shame, it's lessening, but it's still there. I still work with families who really struggle to accept their child's diagnosis of ASD, because when they were growing up, the parents, children, or autistic children, and I put that in inverted commas, were very impaired and strange, and couldn't really engage in the world. This is their perspective of it. Whereas now, of course, we know that we absolutely need people with ASD for this world to run and function and to be keeping going. So over time, I think the shame and the stigma will lessen again, but it's still there. We've got to accept that, and we've got to give people the chance to talk about their worries and their concerns about the diagnosis and what they think it means for them and their children and their friendships and relationships. And by talking about it, hopefully they can then start to understand this is not a diagnosis that is going to, change your life forever. It is just a way of understanding your brain, a way of understanding why you struggle with some things maybe and not others, and a way of, understanding yourself, and hopefully then gaining more compassion for yourself.
Well, I think compassion is what oils the wheels of divorcing and separating and coming to a settlement and a resolution, isn't it? And that compassion, then obviously, if you can maintain that, and it's easy to say and hard to do, but if you can maintain that, then you have a better shot at cooperative parenting and protecting your children. But I guess there's also quite a lot of fear if you've been a couple, and almost being a couple sometimes allows you to compensate, doesn't it, for some particular deficits that you might have, and it allows some of the positive things that come from being neurodiverse, it allows them to shine. So if you're then looking at a world of being alone and on your own, I guess that can add another level of fear and concern on top of what you would expect normally to face in that kind of situation as well. So a scary time.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. But more than ever, we are living in a world that understands this and can adapt to it. It's still not perfect, but we're definitely getting there. And things like, going back to working, for example, if you've been a parent who has been out of work while your children are younger or something like that, and then after a divorce, you're thinking about going back to work and you're neurodivergent, then, that can be quite scary to think about. But these days, work environments, a lot of them are so much better at understanding what neurodiversity is and how to work with it and get the most out of it. So yes, but scary times, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit now about the children. So children, when you're divorcing and separating, you've come on the podcast before, Angharad, and we've talked strategies for minimising the impact on children, and people can listen to those. So more specifically today, we're looking at the additional impact if you have a child, a neurodivergent child, the more specific impact that a divorce and separation may have. Can you just talk us through some of that to start with? What, in addition to the normal stresses and strains of mum and dad separating, or mum and mum, or dad and dad separating, what are the additional things that the children might face?
Well, the first thing is that there's a very good chance that pre-divorce, that child would have grown up in a house where the parents were less happy together. So we know there's a much higher chance of parents divorcing when they have a child with neurodiversity, because of the stresses that can create, because of the differences in opinions, like we've just been talking about diagnosis and labels, and different parents can have different ideas about it. So it's very stressful bringing up a child with neurodiversity. And so this is something that by the time they get to the divorce, they've already potentially heard a lot of arguments, about them, which is quite crushing for a child to think, oh my gosh, I've all children will think that somehow they've created a divorce anyway. But then if they're aware that arguments have been about, I don't know, their medication or who's taking them to the next therapeutic appointment or why this adjustment should be made or not, then actually it can just build up that sense of it's because of me. Somehow I've created this. So that's a lot for children to bear and to process. But then living between two houses, we know is difficult for most kids anyway, at least to start with. But if you think about a child with neurodiversity who has a need for sameness, then this is incredibly difficult. You're moving from one house to the other. And even if you've got two parents who are working incredibly hard to create the same routines, the same rules, the same boundaries in each house, it is still a different house. It's got different smells, it's got different noises, it's got different feels to it, and I work with some children with ASD whose parents are divorced, and typically it's the dad who maybe moves into a flat, and it's a new build flat, and it's got a funny smell, and it's got the sound in the corridor with all the stairs that it's just really it's all these things that is kind of hard for us to realize how difficult that can be for a child to have to adapt to. And we also know that children with neurodiversity can find school incredibly hard. So, they know they've got to go to school, they go to school, and they super heroic attempt to get through school. One way or another, they get through the school day. It is. And it's exhausting for them. And coming home after a day at school is their release. It's their relax time. They come home and often they can't even talk for about an hour and a half. They just literally got to switch off, go and play their games, go up to their room, whatever they need to do to just completely unwind after a day of acting neurotypical. And again, that's in inverted commas. So imagine if on a Wednesday, you can't go to your standard home, you've got to go to the other home. And usually you go for dinner out because that's what that parent likes to do. They like to treat you. They like to make a special time of it. Then suddenly midweek, when you're already pretty exhausted, you've now got to adapt and adjust to all these other new changes. And will I like the food that's on the menu in that restaurant? And if I do go to the cinema, will I be sitting next to somebody who's got really noisy popcorn or crisps? So all of these things, I think we just have to be aware of, that actually children neurodiverse children may be fine with divorce. They may, as with neurotypicals, after a couple of years, maybe start to slowly but surely adapt and adjust to it. But there will be things that will get in the way of that sometimes. And we just have to be aware of that as parents and ask the child. Don't assume, just ask. What is it? What are the smells? What are the sounds? What does it feel like being there? So you're asking so that you can start to get a picture of what will help them make that adjustment between houses. And I know some parenting plans have to be quite flexible. So, for example, at times of stress, so let's say it's exam time, let's say your child's got GCSEs coming up, it's a particularly stressful time. Anyway, we know neurodiversity kind of is exaggerated at stressful times. So maybe you might have to adjust for those 6-8 weeks, the parenting plan around contact and moving between homes and stuff, just to try and contain the levels of stress. So you might have to be particularly flexible and kind of sensitive to your child's needs at those times.
And Anthony, I know that you're really keen on the voice of the child, and how do you, Angharad made the point there that you can ask the child, how do we work with children who can express opinions, so they're old enough to have a point of view? What's your experience of, what happens when you ask? Because I guess lots of parents might be quite fearful of asking because they might not get the answer they want. So how do we work with that?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to include the voice of the child in these conversations. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you are asking them very direct and specific questions, but it's more just getting an idea of what their voice is, what their thoughts are around the situation, what's important to them. If you were going to be spending time in both homes, what would be important for you to have in both of those houses, and just encouraging them to be involved without necessarily being the decision maker, so that it doesn't feel like something that is just happening to them, but it's something that they're a part of. And I think that it's really important that we are talking about some of those sensory elements as well, because I think that's something that often is overlooked, particularly for neurodivergent children. It might be things like the material of the bed sheets or the weight of the duvet cover. it could be about the routine. So that the order in which things are done in the morning, whether it's shower first or breakfast first, rather than all of those things being done in both houses. Because that's another big change, is that where children are spending time in both houses, usually that means that one of the parents who is normally doing that routine, the other isn't aware of what that routine is. And so I think it's just a lot more conversations around, well, what does this look like? What's important to you? And also being very aware that you're probably not going to get it right immediately. It's going to be something that there will need to be ongoing conversations about. And importantly, some of those conversations will need to be between the parents, because it might be that the other parent is made aware of, oh, actually, when I'm at mum's, she does this in this order and I don't really like it, but I don't want to tell her. So you need to be open to having those conversations as parents as well as with the child too. It's an ongoing conversation, as most of these things are.
Well, I think that's a really good point, isn't it? Because sometimes I think we think of, doing a parenting plan or whatever as being a sort of once in a lifetime of the child thing, and we just do it and then we move on and then it's supposed to all be all right. But I think this constant coming back for review and having a safe space to talk about what's working and what's not working and to be able to adjust, I think it's really important that's the ongoing help that people can provide, isn't it? I'm just thinking about, often I hear parents say, well, I don't want to be dictated to by her or him or whatever. When Johnny or Julia with me, it needs to be like this because I'm in charge in my own house. How do we get past those conversations where people think the other parent is being controlling and not being able to see that actually perhaps what's going on is trying to be in the best interest of the child, but it's coming across to the other person as very kind of controlling or ordering? What sort of experience can we bring to those situations, Angharad?
It's very difficult, isn't it? Because this is the power play that's going to be acted out in any divorcing couple as parents. There's this expert and the non-expert sense of, I'm the one who knows the most about our kids. I understand our kids most. You don't. And of course, the poor non-expert parent is then in a vicious cycle of spending less and less time with their children, getting less and less confident. And so starting to sort of back away a little bit because they're thinking, well, I clearly don't know how to do this. We know that divorce it kind of magnifies the differences between parents. So everybody's different and the way we parent is different. And if you're lucky enough to have a partner who you've got similar kinds of parenting styles, that's great. But, a lot of the time it's trying to converge really. And then once you've divorced, of course, you then feel like you've got permission to go back to your parenting style. You don't have to adapt to anybody else's parenting style anymore. You can do it your way. And then this can come out in quite a sort of bolshy way a lot of the time. So I'm doing it my way and finally I can be the kind of parent I want to be. So again, it's about a process of adjustment and transition. And also, it's not about who's the best or the worst or the expert or the non-expert. This is absolutely not how we should be thinking about parents. These are two different parents who are trying to figure out how to best adjust to and adapt to their children's needs. And we know that parents, the best parents are those who aren't kind of inflexible, rigid, I am this kind of person, but they are able to adapt to their children. So this does not mean you're being dictated to by a child, just as if you had a child who had, for example, mobility issues. You wouldn't be then saying, oh my goodness, they're really dictating everything here. This isn't right. Just because it's a brain thing that we can't see, that doesn't mean that it's a chosen thing, that someone's putting it on, that someone's kind of pretending this is how a person thinks, and we have to be aware of that and adapt to it. So I think it's over time, just like Anthony was saying about conversations and keep coming back to the conversations, is about adaptation and flexibility, which can be tricky if you are a parent with neurodiversity, but it's over time just really starting to think about, what does the child need? What do they need right now? And what does this mean about how we parent them? And how can we work together to, as much as possible, create a consistency that means that this child's characteristics or the neurodiversity characteristics come down a little bit, which means then they can engage in life a bit happier and a bit more completely. And then that becomes then a virtuous cycle of sort of positive experiences.
Mm. And I guess, Anthony and I work a lot with couples who have chosen amicable and therefore they are, more inclined to be cooperative and amicable. Not always, but usually. But if you're listening to this and you're in a situation where there isn't much hope or much cooperation in your parenting relationship, are there things you can do that protect your child if you're in that situation, and that can dampen down the sort of neurodivergent brain rather than exacerbate it? What tactics can I do as a solo parent rather than a cooperative parent?
The biggest thing is to reduce conflict. So we know any child struggles to see conflict, and especially conflict between the two people they love most in the world, i.e. their parents. So trying to dampen down that conflict, trying to reduce it, trying to minimize it, not to criticize the other parents, and just to, again, sort of slightly superheroic attempts to be understanding and tolerant and compassionate to everybody, i.e. your ex as well as your child, because it's about a transition time. You won't always have to be like this. You won't always have to be the one who understands, who adapts, who tries to make it better. But just right now, for the sake of your child, trying to just create a sense of safety, emotional safety and predictability and certainty, that can just then ease things up. So it's a definitely good long-term game to play, even if in the short term it feels even more exhausting for you as a parent and a bit unfair. You might be thinking, well, how come the other parent has got away with it and they're just doing whatever they want and I'm the one here trying to sort it all out? As unfair as that may feel, and it is, the positive outcomes that can come from that are well worth it.
Well, life's not fair, as my mother used to tell me all the time. So okay, thanks. Yeah, I get it. Is hard, isn't it, if you're trying to be the bigger person all of the time? But the benefit of that is it obviously it has a huge impact on your child's ability to transition and to cope. And as you say, it's a temporary situation and things will move on. I'm just conscious of the time. We're talking about neurodiversity and neurodivergent children and adults. Where do you point people to? What can you help with if people have got neurodivergent children or they have neurodivergent partners and they're looking at divorce and separation?
There's an awful lot of information out there now, and most firms who work around divorce will have something now, some information about neurodiversity. The National Autism Society in the UK has an amazing website with loads and loads of information about what it means to be neurodiverse and what kind of adjustments might help in certain situations. But this is still, unfortunately, a relatively new field. It shouldn't be a new field, but it is a new field. So there's not masses of books or resources quite yet out there. But as I say, the NAS website is an excellent one for resources.
And any final tips, Anthony?
Main tip would be to take your time to try and find a process that is going to work in the best possible way for you. There are options out there, and if people are confused or wanting any more information about the legal process or the options available, you can always contact one of the team at Amicable through our website.
Thank you, Anthony. And what about from you, Angharad, final couple of tips for people if this is an issue that affects them?
I think the most important thing is to remember that people think differently. And it's an attitude and it's a position that you can take in your thinking that can help you get through a really difficult time like this. So nobody else thinks exactly the way we think. Nobody else sees the world in exactly the way that we do. So it's about being curious and being open and understanding that difference is okay. It doesn't have to be threatening. It's okay. And we just need to learn a little bit more about it to kind of help us feel comfortable. So I think just being open-minded, not judging, not assuming because somebody has a neurodiversity that means they're a bad person or a bad parent or a awful partner or any of those things. It just means that they see the world slightly differently, and really kind of understanding that and what it means for you and your family, I think, is the biggest and most important thing you could do.
Thank you. And where can people find out more about you, Angharad? Where do you hang out on social media?
Well, I'm on Instagram and I am on LinkedIn. I'm relatively quiet on social media, but I can be contacted on those platforms. But I also do a lot of work with only mums and only dads. So we have a website, What About Henry, and it has lots of information about courses. So, for example, we're doing a course for professionals about neurodiversity in September, just a 1-hour session. But it's also got information for parents as well about What About Aruna videos, which is how to divorce with children, bearing in mind child development and stuff. So maybe Only Mums and Only Dads would be a good place to find me as well.
Fantastic. Well, that sounds like a really useful resource. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Anthony, as well. It's been great talking to you both today. You can, of course, visit the Amicable website for more information on separating co-parenting and doing that as a neurodivergent parent or with neurodivergent children as well. That's amicable.co.uk. You can find us on the usual platforms as well, on social media, and you can find me. I'm on LinkedIn at Kate Daly. Thank you both very much for joining me. It's been fascinating talking to you, and thank you, everybody, for listening.